This video is about academic capitalism and how does it impact research in general. If you are unfamiliar with academic capitalism, I would suggest going back and looking at the previous two videos, which I did by the same author, Hostler, on academic capitalism. And that will give you an idea, a definition of what I mean by academic capitalism from the angle of this author, that is, and in general, and the relationship with traditional research governance at universities, and how that changed over time, especially within the last 40 years, since the introduction of the concept of neoliberalism and managerialism. And so this video I will briefly go through academic capitalism and how it impacts research. The material for this video is from a researcher called Thomas Hostler, and it's called Open Research Reforms and the Capitalist Universities, Areas of Opposition and Alignment, published in 2024 in the journal Collabra Psychology. And I've included the full article details for you on the first slide. So academic capitalism has had, Hostler says and discusses, it has had a lot of effects and influence on the process of research, and also the resulting quality, the quality that we see of knowledge that is out there, that is produced, that is published and available to the public or not, sits behind subscriptions. And these issues have been discussed in details, he says, so he briefly explains this whole process under this research article, which I will go through and also summarize all of what he talked about. So in general, how does academic capitalism impacts research? So first of all, market forces, they dictate criteria for research picks, what gets picked up in research. So the market forces at the meso level dictate, so that is at the university governance level, dictate the criteria for which type of research gets rewarded in the macro level, at the level of the researcher. And the unavoidably imperfect nature of these criteria, that results in deviating between what is good for scientists and what is good for science in general. And then this in turn, this first point in turn results in and leads to incentivizing the production of research, which further careers and market performance, but not the development of human knowledge itself. Key metrics researchers are assessed based on include the number of published pieces of research and the number of citations per publication. So, in other words, research is produced to further careers and market performance. And here, Hostler further explains the publish or perish effect of academic capitalism here interacts with the bottleneck of the publication process to incentivize research which has publishability, but not necessarily validity. So the publish or perish culture incentivizes publishable research, not necessarily valid research. And then he further explains, publishability involves criteria related to the perceived novelty and significance of research, values which also exist in the traditional research governance model. Publication standards, they consist of journal policies, editorial decision-making, standards and scope of peer review, and as well as tolerance of breaches of citation ethics. All of them are an important contributing influence on these issues, independent of academic capitalism. However, Hostler explains academic capitalism indirectly sustains these standards in a feedback loop. So what happens is that publishability influences competition between journals for university library subscriptions, while at the same time simultaneously being funded by efficiency-conscious library budgets. So journals basically are funded through the efficiency-conscious library budgets of the capitalist university, and because of that, they must compete with each other for library subscriptions. Okay. And then that whole process, which I just explained, in here, quantitative matrix ends up guiding university libraries' decision-making on the types of journals to subscribe to, exacerbating the existing issues with these incentives, while at the same time becoming a barrier to reform. So in other words, libraries' decision-making on which journals to subscribe to is done partly by considering these quantitative journal impact factors and journal rankings, which I spoke about in a previous video. And journals typically pursue performance on these metrics by publishing research which fits traditional standards of novelty, of originality, that is, and significance. And therefore, academic capitalism, what it does in here, it exacerbates existing issues with these, incentives, with these performance metrics, and impact factors, journal rankings, etc. While at the same time, it acts as a barrier to reform. So this is the process of how, briefly, which I summarized briefly on this slide, using Hostler's explanation about how academic capitalism impacts research in general. What does also academic capitalism do? It also influences research misconduct, something that is very important to understand and explain to you. And Hostler mentioned that the most severe example of discrepancy between what gets published and also good research can be seen in cases of fraud. And I've listed these here, and I'll explain these right now. So this includes fabrication and manipulation of data, of research data, the self-plagiarism, which is very, very common, and I've seen it while I was doing my PhD. You come across an article and you think, oh, I've seen a similar thing being just redone in a different publication. Wasting my time and probably your time as well if you've noticed the same trend. Or it could be through duplication of publication itself. So the same article gets published multiple times in different ways. And these methods are used to improve a researcher's performance based on these metrics. Based on metrics, which are the quantitative performance measures that we talked about, quantitative journal impact factors and journal rankings and so on. How many publishable work you've done, how many grants you've been on, how many you've won, how many titles you've got that you can mention on your webpage, university webpage, and so on, if you've noticed these. So there is that increase in fraud through these such methods that I've just mentioned. Also, academic capitalism, what it does, it also exacerbates the likelihood of fraud by increasing the benefits of perpetuating it via the publish or perish culture, and therefore making it cognitively easier, Hostler says, to justify this process over and over again. So it perpetuates frauds, making it easier to justify the publish or perish with a publish or perish culture. And the third way is by obscuring the likelihood and severity of negative consequences, as many institutional investigations into research misconduct are not reported publicly to avoid reputational damage. And that is another issue that is also common in terms of research misconduct. So it obscures negative consequences. And another way is, Hostler mentioned, was there is more prevalent, which is more prevalent than fraud, are the questionable research practices, QRPs, which are gray areas of acceptable practice that can be exploited to enhance publishability. And what they do is that they grease the way, he says, through the publication bottleneck by improving the aesthetic presentation of research to exaggerate or fabricate standards of originality or research significance that it would not otherwise possess if presented honestly. So questionable research practices are accepted, basically, through greasing the presentation of the research itself, making it more presentable, that is, and exaggerating, fabricating standards, and so on, or the novelty of the research or its significance. And Hostler explains that while these QRBs, questionable research practices, are not original, their use is undoubtedly, he says, incentivized by the increase in competitiveness caused by academic capitalism. So academic capitalism increases competition, and thereby, by that, these questionable research practices become more normalized, he said, in other words, and incentivized. Under the traditional research governance model, the expectation for producing original and significant research for all researchers, he says, was not universal, but in the competitive market, it is ubiquitous and linked to employment conditions and the livelihood and survival of researchers in academia itself. And that is why conducting and publishing multiple small studies using questionable research practices represent an effective strategy for survival by researchers and academics under these conditions, very, very competitive conditions. It is therefore not surprising that the pressures of publish or perish have been linked to researchers' admittance of using, intending to use, or tolerating these questionable research practices in research. So that's really important explanation that Hostler gives about how these questionable research practices end up affecting academics in this competitive market of universities and research. And finally, I wanted to also touch and talk about another important point, which is the consequences of fraud, the consequences of these questionable research practices, which Hostler also talked about. So what these things do, fraud and questionable research practices, is they increase in research that is epistemically unreliable, he says, which end up stalling the incremental progress of knowledge accumulation and also damages trust in the entire collaborative research endeavor needed to sustain the system. And this, in turn, this epistemologically unreliable research, this in turn diminishes the ability of the system to retain, to keep researchers and academics, and results in what he calls leaking away of trust among researchers, and in particular, those early career researchers who often enter academia as intrinsically motivated and with humanistic ideals. These researchers are subsequently, what happens is that they get confronted with the reality of the regimes of valuation, which I talked about and explained in the previous video by the same author, creating frustration and creating also disillusionment, another important point. And it is this frustration that has been the main source of fuel for the grassroots, he says, movements of things like open research and other, and trying to do other ethical practices, which are not necessarily, they're not necessarily improve things. They did improve things, but also maybe went hand in hand with the academic capitalism. So I'll summarize the consequences of fraud and QRBs, as you could see on this last slide, in that research becomes increasingly epistemologically unreliable, stalling knowledge progress and damaging research trust. Academic roles diminish, and trust among academics leaks away. And this leads to frustration and disillusionment, which settle in among researchers and academics, especially early career researchers. So I hope this video gave you an appreciation, a very brief explanation about academic capitalism and how it impacts research.